Product Dynamics Chapter 12, Part 3, Performance-Based Contracts in IT Outsourcing. There are, broadly speaking, two extremes of contracts, more on the input contract where the supplier gets paid on how many hours he or she spends, on how many components were used, and on the outcome of the activity, so on the performance. Traditionally, the first category is by far dominant, but more and more, especially in services, we get the second one, the performance-based contracts. And one of the reasons why is because it's so difficult to specify on the basis of input whether or not a service is performed correctly. And that generates a whole series of new problems with performance-based contracts. One of the experts in this field on performance-based contracts is Professor Finn Weinstra, a colleague of mine from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And I proudly steal some of his slides on the topic based on a paper that we published together on Collaborative KPI. So the first slide then from Finn is on outsourcing, the art of letting go. One of the main worries that this slide shows, which is again by Finn stolen from Accenture, is that the worry that customers have on whether or not their operational performance will continue to be okay when they outsource things. And because of that, they have an inclination to at least have a contractual grip on that this performance will remain okay. And in fact, keeping that grip is one of the main concerns during the outsourcing process. The problem of ongoing managing and monitoring, E up there, is very high on the importance scale for many of the companies that look at outsourcing. So there lie some of the reasons why outsourcing is why performance-based contracts are so popular in outsourcing. So as I said, broadly speaking, you have two extremes. There is behavior-based and outcome-based. And well, let's take the example of me and my garden at home. I can do everything, of course. That would be best in the garden. Sometimes it gets difficult. Sometimes I don't have the time, so I ask somebody else to help me with the garden, my gardener. I can pay him by the hour. That's input based. That's simply the time he spends. And if he has to use some tools for which he uses gasoline, then I can pay him also for the gasoline. And if he needs his car to drive back and forth to get some of the waste from the gardening away from my house, that's also an input. I could, but I won't, specify precisely how he would have to mow the lawn, which he doesn't, or cut the trees, etc. Would be silly because he knows much better how to do that. But in some cases where the customer is really powerful and has lots of expertise, or where there are regulations why you can't do it a different way, also the behavior, the process is something which is monitored by a contract, the statement of work then. So then, for instance, in the process industry, you can ask contractors to do a certain amount of work, but you as the asset owner are still responsible for the quality and the safety there. So they have to follow your regulations in doing that work. They can't do it their own way. Even more towards outcome-based is based on the output of the performance. So I don't care so much what my gardener, how much time it takes him to do the garden. I come back and I want it done cleanly and everything cut and all the leaves, etc. removed from the house. And in fact, I don't care if he comes once a month, or twice a month, or 3 times a month. I'm mainly interested in that the garden is tidy. And so I'm pretty sure that will be okay. What I cannot be sure about is if I'm paying too much or not enough. I could even go further and say, you know what, my main concern is that my children can play nicely in that garden, and when I have visitors, they are pleased in there. So my customer satisfaction is really what counts, because if I are entertaining a party and the gardener comes there and starts working in the garden while my guests are around, the garden will be okay, but my guests won't be happy, and neither will I be. So in that case, the output may be good, but the outcome is not really what I wanted. And between those extremes, most of the contracts lie, and there's a trend from more input-based, behavior-based towards more output and outcome-based. Now, very broadly speaking, for the quality, if I only specify the input, then the quality is at risk for the customer. Probably not how much I pay as a customer, but what is at risk is what I'm going to get for my money. On the other hand, if it's more towards output and outcome specifications, then I can be more assured that as a customer I'm getting what I want, but I may be paying far too much for it. And the risk then lies for the quality leads for the supplier. The supplier may need to spend much more time there than he estimated earlier on, and therefore may lose money, although the output may be good. Of course, risk also has its reward. It can also be that the supplier finds a way of doing this smarter than I originally thought possible, and so makes money out of that. So those are the two extremes. And there's quite some theory on what type of contract would be preferable. On those two extremes of the outcome and versus the behavior-based contracts, the theory of principal-agent theory or agency theory, which is an important theory in economics, gives us quite some clues as to in what situations what type of contract will be more preferred. So if we take the type of the contract on the one hand, the outcome versus the behavior-based contract here, and we take the performance towards the customer on the other extreme, then there are quite some things that we can say, quite some relations, causal links that we can assume. Here's the first one. The more that what the customers gets, what the supplier does is in line with what the buyer wants, well, the better performance will be. Seems likely, isn't it? And since if we specify the outcome, then there would be alignment. So a more outcome-based contract will be more in alignment with the buyer and therefore get better performance. That's the main line of reasoning, I suppose, behind many of these performance-based contracts that you see now so often in the public sector and in the private sector. On the other hand, one of the limiting factors there is the risk aversion of the supplier. The supplier knows that he or she will have to get the right performance, but is not sure how much trouble that will cost, how much money, how much time. Will they still be making some money? The risk pattern of the buyer is precisely the opposite. If I don't trust this gardener at all, I will not pay him by the hour. I will pay him if I think that the garden is neatly done, and that's a fixed amount that I will pay for him. I will pay for that service. So that's very much an outcome-based process. You could say that the more that it's likely that we'll have a goal conflict between the buyer and the supplier, that the supplier really wants something else than I do, which is, for instance, different than if you look at the chapter 9 with the collaborative planning case, the case of the optical storage within Philips. The more optical drive Philips would buy or sell, the more chips Philips Semiconductors would be selling. So there you did not have a goal conflict. But if you have a goal conflict, then usually, since the buyer is more powerful, in most cases you end up in an outcome-based contract. Of course, the better the outcome is measurable, the easier it will be possible to specify an outcome-based contract. In services, that's often not so easy. You could also say the other way around. If the outcome is very difficult to measure, it becomes silly to try and specify an outcome-based process. You should focus much more on a behavior-based one. Well, in this particular case, the gardener, I've known my gardener for 15 years and we've drunk many beers together. This is a good relationship. I trust him. I know he does excellent work. So I simply hear from him how many hours he spent. And interestingly, since I trust him more, I can simply specify, or I can simply pay him on a behavior-based contract. If the task is also more easier to program, it also becomes less risky for the supplier to say yes to a behavior-based contract, because then at least he knows, okay, it will take me 5 or 5.5 hours, but it will never take me 10 hours. Unfortunately, it will never take me 2 hours also, so why not pay me on the basis of the hours? If the outcome becomes very uncertain, well, it's the other way around. The outcome is very uncertain. The more that that's the case, the more silly it becomes to specify an outcome. So let's specify a behavior. Write me a hit single. Yeah. Well, if we could program it like that, very few composers can. Let's say, okay, I pay you at least for making some music. The quality of information systems. The more that you can have everything under control, the less it's likely it's necessary to specify the outcome. Similar in information, if I have lots of information on what the supplier behaves, I don't have to put that anymore in the contract. And also more likely it is that the supplier will behave in alignment with the supplier. That's a bit of the transparency and trust loops that we saw earlier on also. So quite a few links between the settings of the deal between the buyer and the supplier, and the nature of the task involved, and the degree in which an outcome or a behavior-based contract is preferable.